Happy Monday, everybody. We're going to be doing the first best of one, best of three meta review for Bloomburrow, and I'm quite excited to share what I've found. So if you're new here, what I do every Monday is I go over the top 8 performing decks according to Untapped, and then I also cover best of 3. And from the tournament winners on Magic the Gathering Online's Standard Challenge, because I think it's a very competitive tournament and a really great way to keep your thumb on what the meta is in best of 3. So with that, let's get started. And we've got Mono-Red Prowess, and it's very similar to the build before. So we've got the Monastery Swiftspear before rotation, that is. So we've got Monastery Swiftspears, we've got the Slick Shot Show-Offs, ditching the 2-1 Prowess for the Emberheart Challenger, which was one that we got at Bloomburrow and was part of the list that I covered earlier this week. That was the #1 Mythic that somebody used, Magic Christian used to climb to Mythic in 4.5 hours. And so we've got Demonic Ruckus to help with like single blockers for the Slick Shot Show-Off, like the white 1/2 flyer that we see sometimes in the life gain space. We've also got the Lightning Strikes and Shocks. So Shock replacing the Play with Fire. And this one's running 4 copies of Might of the Meek, because we do have some mice synergies, bringing in the Manifold Mouse. This one giving a mouse either Trample or Double Strike. So if it already has Trample from the Monstrous Rage, you can basically build your own Embercleave. Works really well with the mouse synergies. And is kind of leaning, so the Rakdos Prowess, the advantage to the Rakdos Prowess build is that you have a higher chance of a turn 3 win. This one, you are better against the other Slick Shot Show-Off decks because you have the ability to shoot it out of the sky. So, as well as finish with a little bit of direct damage burn if it comes down to that. So that was the one that was performing, according to the tracker, better on average, bronze to Mythic. This one looks like a pretty safe craft. Second place was Rakdos Prowess, and this is very similar to the list that I covered that Magic Christian took to Mythic #1, deciding to run both the Blackcleave Cliffs and the Sulphurous Springs. You do not need to run these if you're wondering about whether or not, because this deck is relatively cheap to craft if you take out the lands. So if you're just running this as 20 mountains, I think the deck works fine. The whole point of this deck is to be able to do a turn 3 off of Slick Shot Show-Off by hitting it with any of the stuff that does 2 damage, or 2 power or more on your combat tricks, because that gives it +4. And if you do 2 of them, then it goes to 9 damage. You hit them for 9, and then you fling it with the sorcery, the Burn Together, Callous Sellsword, and since you're playing another spell, it gets +2/+0, and you deal 11 damage. So this was the list that if your opponent isn't running interaction, you really punish them, right? Because there's several different lines to get to 20 as well. Both the Heartfire Hero and the Cacophony Scamp are able to hit your opponent for 3 times its power. So if it goes unblocked, you then don't sacrifice the Cacophony Scamp. Fling it with the Callous Sellsword, the Burn Together Adventure. It deals damage equal to its power, and then it deals damage equal to its power again when it dies off of its ability. So you can hit for an incredible amount of damage with these specifically. Then we've got the Dreadmaw's Ire. Some people were talking about pumping the Dreadmaw's Ire up to 4. The tracker says that this one's the best. How much you want to lean on the tracker. There's, so many different ways that tweak it by a little bit. I don't think it's that important. I was interested, the original list was running a 3-1 split, and I thought that was because they just lacked the ability to craft the other Emberheart Challengers. But the tracker is saying that if you even decrease the Emberheart Challenger by 1 and increase the Fugitive Codebreaker up to 2 instead of 1, that you can get some late game dig off of this card, and might be worth actually considering playing a 2-2 split here. And this one, you'll have to forgive me for having it mostly uncrafted at the moment. I do collect all of the cards through draft primarily, so it takes me a little bit longer. But this one is going to, this one's basically like your most Bloomburrow specific deck that really is coming through is the Selesnya Rabbits. So we've got a ton of rabbits from Bloomburrow, Ace Archer, being able to pump up your other rabbits. There's just a lot of rabbit synergies. It's kind of a go wides strategy as well. So this getting power and toughness equal to the number of creatures you control, and hop to it, spawning 3 1/1 rabbit creature tokens. And this almost plays like a Gleeful Demolition in Boros Convoke. So you can use this to play the Knight Errant of Eos like you would off of a Gleeful Demolition. It's a little bit later than turn 2, but it's still turn 3. And kind of falls into that same kind of synergy. One copy here of the Season of the Burrow, and being able to return stuff from the graveyard, exile problematic blockers, create a bunch of bunnies if you want to. You can just make 5 rabbits. The Warren War Leader then also can be an offspring creature, so you have to get up to 6 mana, which we'll talk about the mana here in a second. But just continuously pumping more tokens onto the field every time it attacks kind of feels like Adeline before rotation. And then also you can use it attacking creatures you control get +1/+1 until end of turn. So it's like Adeline, but also a board pump in one card, and is I imagine going to see play even outside of the rabbit decks. The Valley Quest Caller is another one that we got in Bloomburrow. It is a Lord for 1 and a white that gives all of your rabbits +1/+1. Pop Hatch Recruit has been really good because if your opponent shoots it with removal, you can move that +1/+, or you get to put a +1/+1 counter on a different creature. So it fits really well into the go wide strategy. Seasoned Wearing Guard, I think, is going to see play even in Boros Convoke. Just because a 3/2 for 1 is really great as long as you do have the token production. And then the kind of pair to the Valley Quest Caller is the Valley Might Caller. And whenever a rabbit you control enters, put a +1/+1 counter on Valley Might Caller. So that can trigger multiple times, and pairs really well with Hop to it, being able to just become absolutely huge. So running Cavern of Souls to help with the missing of the slow lands in the Selesnya space, and running a relatively large count of lands because we want to be able to do the Offspring on 2. So the land count is at 24, which for best of 1 is pretty high. But I'm looking forward to playing this deck after I've drafted the set and collected all of the rares. Fourth on the list was Mono-Black Skeletons, and this one surprised me because I thought it was going to be a Mono-Black discard deck. And I think the problem with the discard deck is that it's kind of matchup dependent. There are certain decks that it absolutely destroys, and then there are other decks that absolutely destroy it. So we'll see if later... the other thing, too, is that the tracker data in the first week tends to be made up of archetypes that were already made, or at least like people were hyped to play. So we'll see if the Mono-Black discard deck shows up later. But this one we've seen already. I've talked about it before in Outlaws of Thunder Junction. Basically, you're using skeleton synergies like the Stat Skeleton, the Cult Conscript, the Forsaken Miner, and the Tiny Bones the Pickpocket, which all work with Corpses of the Loss, getting +1/+0 and haste. And then if you have something that descends, you can play this again. So this actually gives you a pretty decent tool against control decks, as well as just being very aggressive. You have the Cut Down and the Go for the Throat, which both help you against the matchup against the Mono Red Prowess or the Rakdos Prowess builds. And then 4 copies of Tiny Bones Joins Up is really just to synergize with Gisa, so that Gisa's crime trigger happens the second that you play Gisa the Hellraiser. So that they don't even have a turn to respond to it. You just get a ton of immediate value. And it also, plays a little bit of hand hate, doesn't hurt to have, but that's the primary synergy there. And then this one also choosing to run 24 lands because we're going all the way up for Gisa and 4 copies of it. And then the Sandstone Verge gives you a recurring crime outlet so that you can continue to trigger your Gisa every turn. Now, usually what I do is I talk about how the decks have changed throughout the weeks, but because this is week 1 after rotation, we kind of have to start with a blank slate. So these are all the decks that we're going to be comparing when we're talking about the archetypes in the future. This was one that I think was... People speculated that this was a place that Boros Convoke was going to go, was into Jeskai, as long as the mana base can support it. And it does have a lot of the pain lands, right? So you've got the Darker Waste and the Battlefield Forge. that are both dealing damage to you to kind of enable the 3-color space. But the payoff for it is that you get the Spyglass Siren. And Spyglass Siren, very similar to the Voldaren Epicure, creates a artifact when it comes into the battlefield. Voldaren Epicure rotated out. And the reason why that's important is because it enables the Gleeful Demolition and the turn 2 Knight Errant of Eos. So this leaning, instead of running the full playset of the Ocean Frontliner, exploring, playing blue. Case of the Filched Falcon also gives us an artifact to be able to hit with the Gleeful Demolition. And then 1 copy of Zoetic Glyph is sort of like the red Melter card, the one that can turn the things into 3/3s. We kind of saw that being explored at the end of Outlaws of Thunder Junction in Best of 3. And I like it because once you've kind of used the Gleeful Demolition, a lot of times your artifacts are just sitting there being tapped for like Warden of the Inner Sky, but not really giving you that much value further on into the game. This one deciding to run a 4-1 split of War Leader's Call in Case of the Gateway Express. That one really comes down to personal preference and the meta that you're coming up against, because if you're coming up against a lot of control, then the Case of the Gateway Express is a dead card. And then if you're coming up against just a whole bunch of pressure, War Leader's Call is not what you want to be doing on turn 3 if you're getting overrun. So we kind of see a fluctuation there in between these. And Sanguine Evangelist is another one that kind of comes and goes, usually instead of the War Leader's Call. So this one kind of doing a 1-1 split there. And really curious to see if... I'm a little skeptical of the mana base being able to actually support the 3-color space and make it really smooth. That was the one downside to this. But it's pretty comparable to Boros Convoke, as we'll cover here shortly. The win rates were not very far off for Boros Convoke and Jeskai Convoke. So this one was the one that I thought was going to kind of be the more popular build after rotation. Leaning on the full playset of the Ocean Frontliner. I still want to bring in more like Get Losts for instant speed interaction for the Slickshot show-offs in the Prowess decks. This one leaning away from that. Again, I use the tracker to eliminate my bias, and so we can just kind of talk about the cards. This one deciding to run a 4-3 split, which we usually see a 4-2 split and not the Sanguine Evangelist. So kind of a different one than we've seen a lot, at least in the Best of 3 space. And still leaning into the turn 2 Knight Errant of Eos, giving everything haste with the Imidane's Recruiter, making everything +1/+1 and pinging, giving everything the Battle Cry for additional damage. Like, it's just a classic go wide strategy. Curious to see how it matches up against the Selesnya Rabbits, though. I think the Selesnya Rabbits is looking maybe a little bit stronger of a token producing space than relying off the Gleeful Demolition because of hop to it. And we might actually see a melding of the two given enough time. Kind of, we'll see if more of the Bloomburrow cards make it into Boros Convoke. Because again, this one's probably just a bunch of people who were playing the list with the easy substitution of, oh, we lost Voldaren Epicure, let's just run the Ocean Frontliners. And I guess they lost the Lunarch Veteran, too. All right, 7th, according to the tracker, was Mono-White Aggro. And I do have to admit that as we start getting down, especially into the 7th and 8th decks, that we start getting into kind of more of a tier 2, maybe even tier 3. They weren't that much above 50% win rate. And so keep that in mind if you are going to be crafting these decks, that it's very early on in the format. I feel pretty solid about Mono Red Prowess and Rakdos Prowess. Outside of that, then I start feeling a little bit less, secure with how the meta will evolve over time. And personally, the Rakdos Prowess deck for me has been coming up against a lot of interaction. So always craft with care. I'm just trying to help out if you're new and returning to Magic, kind of orient you with a lot of the popular decks that you'll bump into on the ladder. So the 7th deck here is Mono-White Aggro, and this is kind of a way to try to keep the Mono-White humans build alive as much as we can, at least. And it's kind of so we've got the Virtue of Loyalty, which helps us with the going wide and eventually pumping everything up to the point where it overruns your opponent. And you can also run this as a relatively low land count because you can just play it out as the flash 2/2 creature. We've got the Elish Norn, which is one that I haven't seen a whole lot, but it does allow you to kind of take advantage of going wide. So for 2 and a white, you can sacrifice 3 other creatures. Better if they're just like little 1/1 tokens to be able to flip this into the Argent Etchings, which incubates and then gives everything double strike, and then you destroy everything except for the Phyrexians, and works as a win condition as long as you have the things to sacrifice. So you can sacrifice the tokens off of like Sanguine Evangelist, the Resolute Reinforcements, and Regal Bunnycorn. We saw this one being explored like 1 or sometimes 2 copies in Boros Convoke. Works in the go wide space. We've also got the Lay Down Arms for sorcery speed removal. Doesn't help as much against the Slickshot Show-Off, but can help us from getting just completely overrun. And this was the card that I was talking about earlier about the benefits of giving Menace to your Slickshot Show-Off. Is some more and more decks are running the Life Creed Duo, which then can at least chump block the Slickshot Show-Off and extend the game for 1 more turn. Similar to the Boros Convoke, we also have the Warden of the Inner Sky and the Novice Inspector being able to just tap a whole bunch of tokens. Takashia's Welcome then giving us the card draw to keep fueling the space here. And notably, we're not running the Knight Errant of Eos, so just going completely in a unique direction, if you ask me. And running 2 copies of Chimil, which I don't know if I can totally support this, because Discover 5 works a lot better when your curve isn't as low, right? But it does eventually give you some late game inevitability, and if they don't have the artifact, like eventually you bury them in value. And the number 8 best of 1 list is Domain. And I've actually bumped into this one a fair amount in the first couple days of the format. A lot of people exploring whether or not the Domain space could still survive having lost the Triomes and leaning on the lands that are double. So like Forest Plains, Mountain Forest, Swamp Forest, right? Like, and then Fabled Passage to be able to go find those, because if you can kind of like patchwork together your domain. Still really centered around the Sunfall, right? So this is a meta-defining card, and you basically, if you're designing a deck, you either need to beat it by aggro, or you need to account for how you're going to rebuild from the Sunfall. And we've got the Lightning Helix, which can help stabilize against the Mono-Red Prowess, as well as the Get Lost. Temporary Lockdown helps with the Boros Convoke Go Wide. We can gain a lot of life off of the Ancient Cornucopia and multicolored cards like the Lightning Helix and the Atraxa. Herd Migration still works relatively well, and Leyline Binding. I thought we were going to see both of these leave, but I've actually, I think it's somewhat viable. It's certainly not as good as it used to be. Archangel of Wrath can also help stabilize against Mono Red. A lot of times this is kind of your game-winning card there. And then Jace the Perfected Mind helps in the mirror match against other domain decks, where it really comes down to mill a lot of times. And so Jace kind of giving you that edge if that's the case. So that's it for best of 1. And now I'd like to talk about best of 3. And so the tournaments that I like to use kind of as the benchmark is the Standard Challenge, which happens on every Saturday and Sunday, and is a tournament done on Magic the Gathering Online. But really top level competition. We see some really great players and tournament grinders in that tournament week after week. And so first place here was Orzhov Midrange by Baz Partey. And Orzhov Midrange actually took down 2 first places, so and it was the same list. So I think this one right now is kind of looking like the deck to beat, and figured that the Orzhov space was actually going to look pretty good. We were speculating on that prior to rotation, just because of we lost like Rafine and we lost the Dinnick, but the white-black space was already being explored at the end of Outlaws of Thunder Junction and was looking really strong. And part of it is because you can change its tempo depending on which cards you're bringing in, and you can play it really controlling with like Sunfalls and the Black Wraths and things like that, or you can play it more aggro and really more tempo, right? So we've seen like Doorkeeper Thralls explored with the Bone Brute, which then negates its negative enters the battlefield effect. So this one's not doing that. This one's doing more of a strictly mid-range build. And so we've got like Virtue of Persistence for early interaction, life stabilization, as well as a late game win condition. Harvester of Misery is able to wipe the board, specifically against Boros Convoke. Akhlazot's Deepest Betrayal gives us some stabilization against aggro if we can make it to turn 5. Virtue of Loyalty giving you that continuing to pump your board, eventually winning the game, as well as just being an instant speed 2/2. We've got the Season of the Burrow in this one as well, so we can return something with 3 or less with an indestructible counter on it, which works really nicely with Zoraline, Cosmos Collar. So I think a lot of I was really excited when we saw this card because it just gives you so much potential graveyard loops. So I was thinking maybe we'd see more like Helping Hands with this specifically to bring it back from the graveyard. Again, that one not really making it into this deck. We see Beza, which I think was our best tool for the kind of like mid-range stabilization to replace the Wandering Emperor. I know it's not perfect, but this deck didn't really care about Flash as much as Azorius Control did. And can basically be a Sunset Revelry built into a 4/5 creature for 4 if you're up against that early aggression. Shield of the Apocalypse is, everybody knows this card already, but if you're returning, this card it can eventually just win you the game by making it so that your opponent loses 2 life every time they draw, as well as you gain 2 life every time that you draw. Which works nicely with cards like Gix that trigger the card draw, and instead of damaging you, well, they damage you, but then they also heal you, and so they damage you for 1, you heal for 2, ends up gaining you more life. Preacher of the Schism is a great mid-range threat, really replacing the Graveyard Trespasser on 3. And then Legions to Ashes is a way to kind of hate on the token decks as well. I think the occasional Azorius Artifacts build can be kind of susceptible to the Legions to Ashes. And then we've got the Cut Down and the Go for the Throat for the early interaction, Deep Cavern Bat for the disruption, early disruption. The Shrouded Shepherd is a way to kind of hate on the tokens as well. So I don't know if the pilot of this deck was anticipating a lot of Boros Convoke, but we've also got the Dust Animist, which can be plotted in and played later to give us some life stabilization. And then we have the Doorkeeper Thrall, which is also really good against the Boros Convoke strategy. Anything that was leveraging the enter the battlefield effects, Doorkeeper Thrall can then silence. So as far as the new lands go, we've got the Fabled Passage to kind of help for the 2-color space. Seems like it's a pretty popular pick for fixing. And then Fountain Port, being able to give us the creating a 1/1 blue fish or sacrificing a token to draw a card, are really the big turn-ons for this deck, and kind of replacing Mirrex. And we'll see how popular of a choice that becomes further down the line. As far as the best of 3 sideboard goes too, we can see a full playset of the Doorkeeper Thrall to bring in against the ETB decks like Boros Convoke. Hostile Investigator is really good against Azorius Control, attacking their hand. Elish Norn is further hate on anything that has ETBs. The Harvester of Misery is additional hate against Boros Convoke. So like I see a lot of signs here that this deck was heavily anticipating Boros Convoke, which was kind of the deck to beat before rotation, and didn't really lose that many tools. So I think we'll see less sideboarded hate against Boros Convoke specifically, since it wasn't actually all that popular of a choice, at least in week 1. Kaya is just an alternative win condition. Duress is good against Azorius Control. Pest Control is good against Boros Convoke, same with Temporary Lockdown. And then Lily on the Veil helps you against the control matchups by being able to attack their hand. And then Gix's Command also helps you against the board flood strategies, being able to wrath the board against Boros Convoke. Second place was taken down by Gruul Aggro by Casa. And we've seen Casa before throughout the weeks. Excellent Magic player. And this one basically being very similar to what we saw prior to rotation, except for running Might of the Meek instead of the Ancestral Anger, and bringing in the Heartfire Hero, so there's not a whole lot of mouse synergies. We do still have the Emberheart Challenger, but it's not running the Manifold Mouse. Still, there's enough. Just giving like the draw card and trample until end of turn works pretty well for the prowess space. And the reason why you see this one the most instead of the mono red prowess and the Rakdos prowess is in best of 3. You're able to be like, okay, well, if your opponent's going to heavily sideboard in single point interaction, then you can end up either putting in Snakeskin Veils or the Royal Treatment as a way to kind of answer and negate that. So you're still going for a very aggressive pace. This one leaning on Thran Portal because of losing the Rockfall Veil. And as far as the sideboard goes, we can see they did have some hate for the Boros Convoke through Tectonic Hazard. Pick Your Poison gives you kind of like, this is an answer to Domain, which was another very popular pick at the end of rotation because everyone was trying to get their last little reps in. If Atrax is their only creature, also the Archangels, there's a couple of things in Domain where they have a single creature with flying that you can snipe. And it also gives you Artifact and Enchantment hate. Obliterating Bolt for problematic threats, especially ones that need to be exiled. So really good if they have a recurring threat. Fire of Resistance is really your answer if they're running a lot of like temporary lockdowns and sunfalls, and like the White Wraths don't hit planeswalkers. So then Koth kind of can help you up against those control matchups. Urbrask's Forge is really good against the mid-range and control matchups. You have to take off a little bit of pressure, so it's not as good if you're up against another aggro deck, so we don't usually see it being played in best of one. But if you're coming up against a lot of mid-range and a lot of control, then the Urbrask's Forge gives you that kind of inevitability as long as they don't have artifact hate. And then Witchstalker Frenzy is similar to the Obliterating Bolt, but can be a lot cheaper if they're playing a problematic blocker like Shieldred. All right, Golgari Midrange by Anonymous took down 3rd place. And it's fun to see Golgari Midrange. I do think it's a better best of 3 deck than it is best of 1. It does really well against mono red. It depends on how much control we're going to see kind of later in the format. So if you really like the Golgari Midrange, now is probably the best time to play the Rock in best of 1. Just because it is weaker to control, better against kind of destroying your. It's got so much just like interaction that you can snipe those slick shots out of the air. But we see the Caustic Bronco is an aggressive threat that can help dig for additional cards. The Mosswood Dread Knight doesn't look as good as it actually plays. Being able to draw a card and lose a life and kind of cycle this back and forth gives you a lot of value. Cut down and go for the throat or the classic black removal. We can replay them with Karavik the Punisher. Creature of the Schism, just great mid-range threat. Glissa is really like the second payoff for being in Golgari, otherwise it's almost a mono-black build. Liliana the Veil, being able to hate against more controlling decks, attacking their hand. Hostile Investigator as well, being able to make them discard. These improve the matchup against the control decks. Shieldred the Apocalypse, the deck still struggles a little bit with Sunfall, so the answer is like get the Sunfall out of their hand with Duress or some sort of hand hate. Shieldred the Apocalypse, a really great stabilizing force in this deck. Same with Aklazot's Deepest Betrayal and Gix's Command, being able to wrath the board against Boros Convoke, bring back stuff against control, or just give you life stabilization with the +2/+2 counters and lifelink. So the best of 3 sideboard, we see the 4 copies of Duress. If you're up against Azorius Control, like anything really running the White Wraths of like Sunfall, you're going to bring in the Duress. We do have the ability to bring in another Liliana the Veil, which, again, better in the control matchups, in my opinion. Malicious Eclipse is for Boros Convoke, and we lost the Path of Peril rotated out, so we're going to be leaning on Glistening Deluge and the Malicious Eclipse. The upside to Malicious Eclipse is that if it dies, they get exiled. The upside to the Glistening Deluge is that you can do a one-sided board wipe where you're not even hitting yourself. So against all of the little white tokens in Rabbits and such, Glistening Deluge gives everything -3/-3, and then your board is just getting -1/-1. So Glistening Deluge can actually be a better option than Path of Peril in the past, and some decks were exploring it. I think at the end there, because it was kind of settled that Path of Peril was better than the Glistening Deluge, but it is deck dependent. Harvester of Misery also giving us another tool against Boros Convoke. So another sign that people were anticipating a lot of Boros Convoke. The Scrap Shooter is a new one, and this one being a 4/4 for 3 certainly gives you enough of an interesting stat block to explore, as well as some artifact and enchantment hate. And then we've got the Phyrexian Arena if we come up largely, I think, for like the mid-range matchup where you're not getting pressured heavily on your life total immediately, and then you can outvalue your opponent by drawing more cards. Worse off the more damage that you're taking early. And then we've got the Tranquil Frillback, which before the rotation, this was really well positioned because of the graveyard hate against the two decks that are no longer around. So the Slogurk deck and the Landfall deck. So it still gives you good stabilization against mono red, and I think this was kind of the deck's inclusion potentially for an early aggressive strategy, maybe Dimir midrange, being able to gain that 4 life. And it's also good against Boros Convoke if they're running the 4/4 split of the Case of Gateway Express and Warleader's Call. All right, so we're going to be covering a total of 8 different best of 3 lists, and I don't usually try to do repeats, but this one had enough different going on that I'm going to talk about the difference between the two. So this one was Golgari Midrange by Sokos 13, took down 2nd place. Again, the Orzhov Midrange deck by John 11111 was the same list as Faz Parte that we already covered. So the Orzhov Midrange took down 2 first places. But this Golgari Midrange deck, if we compare it to Anonymous's deck, then we can see that they decided to run 2 less of the Glissa Sunslayer, dropped the Karavik the Punisher entirely, dropped 1 copy of Aclazot's Deepest Betrayal, and instead brought in a full playset of the Caustic Bronco and 1 additional copy of Shieldred the Apocalypse and 1 Phyrexian Fleshgorger. So this one giving you some life stabilization that can really help up against the mono red matchups and the Dimir midrange matchups, especially because it's an artifact, so Go for the Throat does not kill it. So I'm curious to see if we'll see Fleshgorgers return. Once upon a time, they were really popular to include. We've also got 1 additional Liliana of the Veil, starting out with 3. Helps the weak spot of this deck against the control matchups. And then we've dropped 1 forest and the 2 fountain ports to run just 4 basic swamps. So the best of 3 sideboard decided to run just 2 duresses instead of a full playset. Exploring 3 of the Cruel Claws heist, which does allow you to attack your opponent's hand. And if you gift them a card and if they have no cards in hand, you can gift them a card and then still be able to play something from their hand, which I've had happen to me in Limited. Really curious to see how this one plays in the constructed space. We've also got Terra Sunder, which was a classic inclusion, being able to be a disenchant or removal at 4. And then we've got 1 less Liliana of the Veil, dropping the 2 Malicious Eclipses and leaning more towards the one-sided board wipe of Glistening Deluge, dropping the Phyrexian Arena and the 2 Scrap Shooters to bring in an additional copy of the Tranquil Frillback, so running 2, and the End, which really helps against the decks that have a single combo piece. So if you've got something in the past, it was really great against like the Reanimator decks in Best of 1, really great against the Wandering Emperor and Jace in Azorius Control, and we've also got the 2nd copy of Aclazot's Deepest Betrayal, being in the sideboard instead of in the main. Again, you're going to bring this in against the decks where they have less exile, less sunfalls, and are more aggressive, because if you can get the lifelinker down, it can really help stabilize against like Dimir midrange and mono red aggro. All right, the 13th one is Rakdos Midrange, and this was piloted by Matt Tsukasa 10, another very familiar name in the best of 3 tournament scene. And this one took down 3rd place. And I'm really excited to see this one, because I was curious to see if we were going to see the infamous Cruel Claw see play in the competitive space. And it did. So this one's not running a tutor, though, to be able to go and put the Insatiable Avarice could put the card that you want specifically on top of your graveyard. So I thought that was the card that was going to be paired with it. This one, on the other hand, is just going off of sheer dumb luck. And we've also got the ability to discover into it, so we can pull it up multiple times. We've got the Shieldred the Apocalypse and 1 copy of Geth, and this one I thought was a kind of a unique inclusion, a creative inclusion, because we do have 4 copies of the Gloomfang Mauler. So I was kind of scratching my head about, like, why do we have the Gloomfang in this deck? And then I was like, oh, well, we can bring it back with a finality counter on it or whatever. We've also got the hand hate of the Binding Negotiation, and we've got Aclazot's for the stabilization, for a full playset of Harvester of Misery. Makes me think Boros Convoke was very anticipated, and maybe it was actually really popular, and just because it was heavily teched against, it didn't do well. Gix's Command also has a full playset, really being able to stall until you can hit into your discovering loops of Trumpeting Carnosaur, Chimil, and the Virtue of Persistence, being able to be early game stabilization and then a win condition. So the best of 3 sideboard, we've got the full playset of Urbrask's Forge to bring in against the decks, the mid-range and the control decks. Soul Guide Lantern if we need some graveyard hate. I don't think we'll need as much as we did in Outlaws of Thunder Junction, because a lot of the graveyard-centric strategies rotated out. Although Golgari Roots has always been kind of lurking in the in the shadows, waiting for its time to come. So it's possible we'll see more graveyard synergies kind of come back. So speculating on maybe needing it for that reason. Agatha's Soul Cauldron also being able to give us some graveyard hate. Not a whole lot of activated abilities in this list, so really I think this is just more of a recurring, almost like a unlicensed hearse. And we've got Shieldred, which kind of is an alternative win condition, 4 copies of the Obliterating Bolt or additional single point interaction, and Brotherhood's End for the red Wrath of choice. All right, and then number 14, so first place on Sunday was Azorius Artifacts by Ignatus97. And so we're finally going to see some control decks come in on Sunday, and which is nice, because, some people like playing control, and I know some people were saying that it's not a viable strategy. Well, a lot of these people were in a very highly competitive tournament and went 10-0 or 9-1. And so control is not dead. It's just Azorius Control is struggling a little bit, but it's definitely not eliminated. So Azorius Artifacts here is a control deck at its heart. You do have the unstable Glyph Bridge instead of the Sunfall, being able to wrath your opponent's board, and then later turn into the Sandswirl Wanderglyph, which can be a very problematic threat for your opponent because it limits your opponent's ability to either play stuff or attack you. We've got the Mightstone and Weakstone, which gives us ramp as well as removal, giving something -5/-5, but the ability to tap for 2 colorless. We've got the Cityscape Leveler, which is the big kind of huzzah for getting to 8 mana. Thousand Moon Smithy allows us to, every time that we're tapping lands to cast an artifact or a creature, it produces these gnomes that are equal to the number of artifacts you have. The problem with getting this flipped is you do have to have the 5 artifacts to be able to actually get this to flip over into the land. So the Simulacrum Synthesizer we got in Outlaws of Thunder Junction is a little bit more reliable, or a little bit easier to get to actually activate. Triggering off of anything that costs an artifact that costs 3 or more. So your Thran Spiders, your Braided Nets. Urza's in here as well, so you can meld the Mightstone and Weakstone for the ultimate haha, I win. Fabrication Foundry giving you the ability to basically ramp into your artifacts, as well as a little bit of like graveyard recursion. Get Lost giving you at least some kind of early interaction, along with the spring-loaded Saw Blades, is like, how do you survive until you actually get to the unstable Glyph Bridge? Same with Glass Casket. And the Iron Crag also fitting in with the Fabrication Foundry for the ramp up to our big threats. The best of 3 sideboard, Market Gnome in the sideboard, I'm not 100% sure when you're going to be bringing this in. I would imagine against the more aggressive decks where you need an early blocker that then gets replaced. Glass Casket, similar against the earlier decks, I imagine you bring this in. Disdainful Stroke and Negates you're going to be bringing in against the other Sunfall decks, the white control space. Cityscape Leveler as an additional threat if you feel like you need a little bit more finishing power. Rest in Peace was the graveyard hate tech of choice kind of at the end of Outlaws of Thunder Junction. Not certain I'm seeing a whole lot, at least in this week, that was graveyard centric, so probably didn't see a whole lot of play with the Rest in Peace or the Kutzel's Flanker. We've got another copy of the Spring-Loaded Saw Blades for aggro, Disdainful Stroke for Sunfalls, and it works against Domain as well. Chromos Seed Sharks can actually help with the Boros Convoke and kind of go wide with them. I really like it in that matchup. Beza, again, here being kind of a mid-range stabilization against early aggression, and the Boonbringer Valkyrie giving you the backup lifelink can help stabilize as well. Second place was Bant Control, and I thought we were going to see some form of Bant Control at the when I was talking about like what the meta was going to look like post rotation, and I was right. So my previous versions of Bant Control had been a little bit more just on the up the beanstalk and running maybe a little bit more of a counterspell strategy, but this one bringing in Jace, this kind of playing like Domain really. Because we've got the herd migrations and the leyline bindings and the Atraxas, and curious to see whether or not the Cornucopia makes it back into this list, because the Cornucopia was being explored instead of the Heaped Harvest. But the Heaped Harvest ramps you and then also gives you the life gain, so might actually work better than the Cornucopia, since the Cornucopia can be destroyed and then you lose the ramp. Not as much life gain stabilization, but usually the life gain is somewhere around like 4 or 5, so you're taking a little bit of a hit there, I think, for the harvest. Temporary lockdown for Boros Convoke, though. The Archangel of Wrath and the Sunfalls. I pretty much already covered this one in best of 1, but this deck typically does better in the best of 3 tempo, and the meta in best of 3 tends to be a little bit slower because you don't have the hand smoother that you have in best of 1, which allows you to run less lands. So if you're used to playing in paper, you're going to like best of 3 more than you're going to like best of 1, unless you're a dirty aggro player. And so in the sideboard here, we've got 3 copies of Negate against the Azorius Control matchup. That was typically a pretty hard one for the Domain lists. Get Lost and Temporary Lockdown for if we need more early stabilization, like against Boros Convoke. The Obstinate Baloth looks really well positioned right now because of how many like Azorius Midrange decks and Golgari Midrange decks were deciding to run Lily for the hand hate. So then you bring in the Obstinate Baloths as a way to punish them running Liliana. We've got Nissa Ascended Animist as a alternative win condition where we can be able to give an overrun effect. Can also work really well against certain decks like the Azorius Artifacts, being able to just have that recurring artifact and enchantment hate. 3 Elspeth Smites, again, giving you even earlier interaction, specifically against Mono Red. And then Tranquil Frillbacks help against Mono Red, but also have some versatility, as I mentioned. And then, more copies of the Obstinate Baloth to really punish Lily. And last but not least is Azorius Control. And so I'm curious to see if this will, like, filter down into best of 1 and we'll actually see the return of Azorius Control. But for the time being, I've actually been kind of enjoying best of 1 being filled with Mono Red Prowess rather than a 20-minute game where my opponent wins at 1 life. But that's what this deck is about. This deck is about maximizing your resources and barely scraping by, and then demoralizing your opponent as you completely shut them out of the game. So Sunfall was still the best card in the Azorius Control area, and it's still around after rotation, so we're going to see some form of white control. The question is whether or not Azorius Control is better than Boros Control, is better than Orzhov Control. So time will tell. The upside to this is, of course, that we get to play counterspells. So we've got No More Lies and 3 Steps Ahead, which saw a lot of play in Outlaws of Thunder Junction. Lay Down Arms kind of being the knockout blow replacement. We've got Final Showdown, which was being explored as an alternative wrath to Depopulate and Farewell, which I think both rotated. I can't remember if both rotated. But we've got Teferi, Temporal Pilgrim, which can give us a nice win condition, kind of like sort of like the Wandering Emperor was a win condition. Since Beza isn't a win condition, it's just kind of a value mid-range stabilizer. And so to kind of make up for that, I think it makes sense to bring in the Teferi. C Double was one that we saw as a way to kind of answer the landfall decks that were trying to throw a big World Souls Rage at you. And since we saw that deck kind of die off, I wonder if the C Double is actually going to work as well as usually it was a sideboard card, so I was kind of curious to see that one included. We have the good old instant speed divination with quick study and temporary lockdowns for stabilization. Tidebinder is good against the other planeswalker decks. It used to be a classic tool that I'd bring in against Azorius Control. It's pretty good against Boros Convoke too, being able to silence the Imidane's Recruiter and the Knight Errant of Eos gives you some interaction there. Deduce is really nice for if your opponent plays around the counterspell and doesn't do anything, you can then draw a card instead. And yeah, it's pretty much the deck. It's very similar to what we saw before rotation. Oh, and sorry, Spellgyre. I knew I was forgetting something. So this one's the one that was kind of like the speculative replacement. And along with the one that can bargain. This one allows you to surveil and then draw 2 cards, which still sees 4, similar to Memory Deluge. It also plays as an additional counterspell. So it's an expensive one at 2 double pit blue, but it does give you an alternative kind of option. Hard to say if this one's actually going to be better than the one that I'm blanking the name on, but I did talk about it during my rotation ready videos. Have to memorize so many names of cards, right? All right, and the best of 3 sideboard, we can see they have the Dust Animist for stabilization, life gain, similar to kind of like the Aclazot's Deepest Betrayal, but less of a recurring threat. We've got the third copy of the Temporary Lockdown for against Boros Convoke. Beza, the Bounding Spring, if we want to play a full playset against the early pressure. A second copy of Sea Double, which they're not just running one in the main, they're also running one in the sideboard. Elish Norn was a classic one against Boros Convoke. Pretty good against like Domain too. Like any of the decks that have the triggered abilities in ETBs, then Elish Norn shuts down. Destroy Evil was the like white tech card of against Esper Midrange, and so we've seen Esper Midrange kind of disappear. So still decent against the Knight Errant of Eos. Negate being a good one to bring in against other control decks. Same with the Tishana's Tidebinders, being able to shut down Planeswalkers, classic, and same with the Jace, the Perfected Mind. So it looks kind of like the pilot wasn't anticipating a whole lot of Azorius Control matchups, which kind of makes sense because I think it got heavily hit by rotation. But these latter bits being what you would want to bring in the mirror match. So thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed. I hope you learned something. If you're returning to Magic, welcome back. And if it's your first time here in my community, welcome. And I just wanted to say thank you, everybody, for being a part of this community. I just hit another milestone. I hit 250,000 views, so we're at 250,000 views, and it's really exciting. And tomorrow I'll be posting the community deck techs, so that if you have a deck that you want me to kind of review and talk about and give you my thoughts, as well as get feedback from the community, look for it tomorrow. It should be posted about this time. And yeah, we'll see how that continues to go. I've also got a couple of my drafts. So like I said, I primarily collect the set by going infinite in draft in best of 1, and that's the content that I do on Twitch. So if you ever want to drop by, primarily on Saturdays, you can come catch me drafting Bloomburrow and trying to collect all of the rares and hit Mythic and all that fun stuff. And let's see, I must be forgetting something. Oh yeah, this Saturday I'll be doing a gameplay video. I don't do a whole lot of gameplay videos. I like nerding out about deck design a lot more, because I'm not the best Magic player in the world, but I'll be playing the deck of your choice based off of the poll here on YouTube, and that'll be on Saturday. And then on Sundays, I go over my best of 1, best of 3. Go over my best of 1 meta breakers, which are all Mythic decks that have above a 60% win rate for at least 50 games, that try to go off the beaten path. So if you're kind of tired of seeing the same deck over and over, try to do some off meta picks on Sundays. And then I'll see you next week to kind of talk about how the decks have changed and how the meta has settled in Bloomburrow. So thanks for listening, everybody. Take care, and I'll catch you later.